Good day to you. If ever there was a theory to consider in private, it's this one that we're studying today, or a perspective if you like. We're talking about the psychoanalytic theory. The psychoanalytic perspective, it's largely attributable to Sigmund Freud, the famous psychiatrist, and it's largely seen as a sexual theory, which is why it's good to consider in private. What this theory focuses on is the centrality of what drives human beings. And according to Sigmund Freud, there really are only two drivers of human beings, two drivers that get us to do things in life. One is a sexual drive, and the other is a death drive, the drive towards death. That feeling of mortality that you have, and for example, having a bucket list is an example of an outgrowth of the death drive. Whereas the sexual drive is something that we're fighting all the time, Sigmund Freud says. He says that we have these urges, and that what we do is we run into reality. Reality he refers to as the reality principle when it operates this way because it curbs all of our desires. The idea that we can't just have sex with everybody, that we can't just reach out and touch everybody. These are the kinds of desires that Freud says that exist and are unconscious. And when we run into reality, that's what curbs those desires. And so we have a lot of repression in life, according to Sigmund Freud. We go through life holding back on a lot of those desires that we're not able to act upon. And it's actually dreams, Sigmund Freud says, that brings out some of these desires. It allows us to live out what's otherwise being repressed. There are three terms that you may have heard before that Sigmund Freud studies. One is called the id, the other is called the ego, and the third is called the superego. The id is the source of those drives. It's that hunger that you have, that sexual drive, that adrenaline for violence. Yes, all of these are drives that come from within, from the id. It's like a raw drive. That's what the id is. And then you have the ego. The ego is the consciousness that you, as you become aware of reality, you start to learn, okay, I'm not able to eat a whole chocolate cake. I'm not able to do that. Reality says that I'm going to have a sugar rush and that I'm going to gain a lot of weight and that my heartbeat is going to go fast. So that's the ego operating there. It's the consciousness of reality. And then you have superego, and the superego is what houses your understanding of morality. The superego is like your character. It's where you're saying, okay, this is not right for me to eat this dessert. It's not right for me to cheat on a spouse. It's not right for me to kill an innocent animal. That's where the superego comes into play. Now let's go into more detail and discuss the part of development of human beings before we get to studying media. The part of development of human beings that has to do with Sigmund Freud. There it's called Freudian Development. And then there's a part of the development that's attributable to another psychoanalyst, and his name is Jacques Lacan. So we're going to study these two people together here for a moment. And when we talk about Freud says, yes, there are two basic drives. You have the sex drive and you have the death drive. And the sex drive is far more powerful than the death drive. He says it's on our minds all the time. And it begins with us as a young people in life. So we have a sucking mechanism. We suck on the mother's nipple. We suck on the bottle. We suck on our finger. Some babies suck on pacifiers. It's a source of pleasure and comfort. And he says that follows us throughout our lives. And that when we start to develop as human beings growing, that the next stage is the anal stage and the phallic stage. And these are stages of seeking pleasure where a child, without knowing the restrictions, just tries to put everything in your mouth. That's what this is referring to. I mean, I remember our kids, we took them down the beach when they were young, they're just putting sand in their mouth. That's what kids do. They try to experience pleasure through their mouths. And so that's what he refers to as the anal and the phallic stage. And eventually there's a term that he uses to describe the interaction between a male and a mother that's interrupted. And this phrase is called the Oedipus complex. You can get the spelling of it in the book. The Oedipus complex is, he says that the mother is a source of pleasure for a young male, and that there starts to develop a sexual relationship between a young male and his mother. And because of the lack of differentiation between the original breastfeeding that the mother provides and then the sexual development of the male. And so he says that the father intercedes here and demonstrates it gets rather graphic in the chapter, through phallic symbolism, that he is has his own male prowess, and that's what causes the interruption of this desire on the part of the young male. It's all very, very perverse in a lot of ways, Freud's psychoanalysis. Now let's move on to Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan, he says that all drives are resulting from the death drive, that's really what motivates people most of all, to fear of death. That's why they work out. That's why they take out insurance policies. That's why they drive cars with airbags. That's why they live fearlessly. It's all about death. And there's a trio of principles operating there, according to Lacan. You've got the trio of the need, demand, and desire. And these three you can read about in the book, how they operate there. But it's language that brings to the forefront the importance of the development of these three elements of a triad in a human being's development. And that there's a further space, it's called the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. And it's similar to Freud's development. You can read about it. The imaginary stage, for example, is where a child starts to realize that there are some things that are not possible, that they would like to do them, but that they can't stay up and cry all night. Eventually they get tired and go to sleep. That's in the imaginary stage. And then you have the symbolic stage as well. So where does this all bring us now to the study of media? Well, that's where we get to the psychoanalytic studies of media. These are studies that have developed out of Freudianism, out of Jacques Lacan's theories of psychoanalysis, and they look at media in different ways. One of them is a phallocentrism dimension of media studies. That's where you look at the depiction of a penis a lot of this chapter has to do with films, but the picture of a penis really in any media content. The gun, for example, very phallic looking. And how many different trailers for movies do you see with a gun pointed like that? It's a very phallic. It's a representation of a penis as carrying connotations of power and symbolism. You see a lot of that, not just in the cinema, but also on television. And then you've also got apparatus theory. Apparatus theory can be applied to any place of media consumption, but again, the book mostly looks at the movie theater, the cinema, and apparatus theory says that the environment in which you take in media is what activates the psychoanalytic properties. And there's this very extended discussion in the book about how the movie theater represents the womb of the mother and the child. And that's why there's this very personal relationship inside of the movie theater. And as part of psychoanalytic theories, there's also the apparatus theory that is discussing voyeurism. And voyeurism is the pleasure of watching objects unseen from a distance. We may think of it as a sexual pleasure, but it's really the idea of watching something from a distance. It's like eavesdropping on a conversation that you're hearing in a diner, for example. That's what voyeurism is. And then there's fetishism. It's another example of apparatus theory being applied. Fetishism is the structuring of an object or a person as a source of sexual pleasure. They become a thing. They become what you become fixated on as your pleasure. And then you have the male gaze. Did you pick up on that in this chapter, the male gaze? You can read about that. It has to do with the perspective of a camera in film as imitating a male's gaze. And it has a very masculine, male-dominant perspective to it. This idea of a male gaze is basically saying that films are structured from the inside of a male's head. And then that leads us to our final concept, applying psychoanalytic studies to media. That's the concept of fantasy. Fantasy is an extended discussion about this. In the chapter, you can read about it. It's basically a mental representation of an unconscious wish being fulfilled. So it's a mental representation. Again, a lot of us think of it as sexual, but it's not necessarily that. Fantasy could involve spending time with somebody that you really know that you can't. You may be married, you may be in a relationship with somebody else. That person that you want to spend time with may be on this other side of the world. That person you may have already gone through a difficult period in your relationship, and a future relationship is no longer possible, but you can still fantasize about it. It's a mental representation of your unconscious wish fulfillment. So all of this is a power of media to draw us to it, and that's ultimately what psychoanalysis is looking at, is what drives us to the media, what gives us that pleasure. And that's going to be the source of your question response today. Have a great day.